All right, everybody. Welcome to this month's North Central Climate Collaborative webinar. I am your host, Hans Schmitz, and I want to be sure and let you all know that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our website in a timely fashion after the completion of the webinar today. Our website is northcentralclimate.org. We also have a poll that will be administered at the conclusion of Laurie's talk today, so please be on the lookout for that and fill it out when you see it. As a reminder, the restrooms, the snacks, and all those things are where you last left them. It is important for an extension meeting to point out all the logistics, but in this case, you know much more than I do about those certain things. And with that, I want to welcome Laurie Nowatzke and turn it over to her for her talk today. Laurie is associated with the USDA Midwest Climate Hub, and I've had the pleasure of being on many Zoom meetings with Laurie, but maybe we haven't met in person or it's only been one time.
We met in Des Moines at Soil and Water Conservation Society last year. So we have met at one meeting that was actually in 3D. So yeah. Great. Well, thanks, Hans. Yeah, and thanks everybody for being here. There's a really great crowd here today. I'm kind of scanning the participant list and I see a lot of familiar names, which is great to see folks jumping in here. As well as a lot of folks I don't know. So for those who don't know me, yeah, again, my name is Laurie Nowatzke. I am coordinator for the USDA Midwest Climate Hub. I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the climate hubs themselves, but by training, I'm a rural sociologist. I'm based in Ames, Iowa, and what I want to share a little bit about today is some social science related research around conservation and climate smart agriculture. And also some two projects that attempt to kind of harness social science research, tap into social science research to apply some of these principles and bring them to life on the ground. So with that, I will, oh, here we go. Yeah, so, that's kind of a quick rundown. So I'll just share a little bit about our organization within the USDA. Share two studies that came out of my PhD dissertation at Iowa State University, and then again, two applications of this this work more generally, not those specific studies, but kind of what we understand about social science in conservation and agriculture today, and how we can use that on a practical level. So for those who aren't familiar with the USDA climate hubs, these entities within USDA started around 10 years ago. We're actually celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. And so they were established in order to facilitate collaboration and communication across the USDA agencies. The three main lead agencies for the USDA climate hubs are the Forest Service, Agricultural Research Service, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And then there are several other USDA agencies that play a key role and support this work as well. There are 10 domestic climate hubs in the United States, and they're all based within either the Forest Service or the Agricultural Research Service, kind of depending on the dominant landscape or needs in each region. And so the Midwest Climate Hub is based in Ames, Iowa, at the National Laboratory for Ag and Environment on the Iowa State University campus. So that's where we are. That's where our team is. We also, several of you, because this is the North Central webinar, some of you might fall into a state that falls in the Northern Plains Climate Hub. And so you're represented by that hub, which is formally based out of Fort Collins, but has staff throughout Wyoming and other parts of the region as well. So every state and US territory has a climate hub associated with it. And I do want to point out that if you're in the Midwest region, you actually are lucky enough to have two climate hubs, because we at the Midwest Climate Hub deal mostly with the ag side of things, but we do have kind of a sister hub, the Northern Forest Climate Hub, which covers the Northeast and Midwest regions, and they deal with all things forestry. So we get to kind of work alongside them, but also find our comfort in our silos, which can be helpful. The climate hubs are established for really kind of several efforts, both within the USDA, across federal government, but also with our partners outside of the federal government. And so these really revolve around assessments and syntheses of existing climate information and research associated with agriculture and forestry. And thanks, Dennis, for pointing out that if you're in Kansas, you're also represented by the Southern Plains Climate Hub, and they're based in El Reno, Oklahoma. Also, we do a lot of outreach and education. So we aim to support our partners in extension and in other outreach focused organizations to link up climate work with ag in the Midwest. Also technical support, so facilitating engagement and exchange. So a lot of convening, really trying to lean into that hub role where we're connecting different partners who might work on different facets of similar issues. And so that's kind of the nutshell of what we do, but you know, we are a really interdisciplinary team at the Midwest Climate Hub. We're growing. I think all the climate hubs can say that they're growing, and so there's quite a bit more capacity and staff coming online in relation to the Inflation Reduction Act and other sources of funding coming around for climate and agriculture and forestry. So if you are less familiar with the USDA climate hubs, we really encourage you to reach out. We would love to hear from folks who are excited to partner with us or just to learn about each other's work. So we have, okay, one more comment here. Yes, an 11th climate hub was established last year. That is the International Climate Hub, and they're based in Washington, D.C. With the Foreign Agricultural Service. So nice to see that we actually do have first folks who are located outside the United States who actually do also have a climate hub that is there to support agriculture, especially in developing nations, but they do some work with other parts of the world as well. Okay, so let's dive into social science. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today revolves around a few frameworks that we rely on pretty heavily in a lot of the conservation and agriculture space. So the first one is the reasoned action approach, and I'm going to throw a bunch of kind of this jargony framework at you first, but I'll distill it down into the parts that really matter here in a moment. So we are all individuals. We all operate under what we presume to be free will, but a lot of these social science, social psychological frameworks suggest that free will is only goes so far, and we are not islands. We do not operate independent of our outside environments, and in fact, our social context determines quite a bit of what we or can inform quite a bit of what we do as individuals. And so Fishbein and Eisen presented the reason action approach in an attempt to understand why and why do people change their behavior or take on a new behavior, and what are the factors kind of influencing them to do that. So this type of framework is used quite a bit, like I said, in kind of the conservation and agriculture space, but it's also applied a lot in issues of public health, like why do people stop smoking or why do people start smoking, and other, you could apply it to kind of mask wearing and all those kinds of things that we think about when it comes to kind of individual behavior. We have choice, but we are also really heavily influenced to make certain choices. So generally, you know, this overly jargony diagram here is telling us that we're really heavily influenced by the social norms around us, the other people around us, and kind of what expectations they set in our social settings. Also, what we believe about those norms, how we feel like we should adhere to them or not. And also if we think we have control over a certain behavior. You might be really heavily pressured to do something, but from the outside. But if you don't feel like you actually have control over that, then you may not actually try to do that. And so aside from just wanting to do something or finding something interesting or compelled to do something, there's lots of other forces that are coming in from the outside that will help determine whether or not someone will choose to you know, intend to take on a new behavior and ultimately adopt it or do that new behavior. Another framework that kind of feeds into a lot of this work is diffusion of innovations, which was brought forth by Everett Rogers quite a while ago. A lot of his work focused around the diffusion or the uptake of hybrid seed in the mid-century in the Midwest. And so Rogers suggested that a lot of this diffusion, how it kind of spread throughout different communities, focused a lot on what the individual felt about this innovation or technology that they were exploring, but also about how that is then communicated to individuals throughout their community. So that's that diffusion piece, that spread. And so in this case, yes, individuals are acting of their own accord, but also they might be influenced by different communication channels, centers of influence, something else that Rogers called opinion leaders. So that would be individuals in a community that hold a lot of credibility and trust and weight with their peers or others in their community. And so this really speaks to how there's all these kind of like intricate reasons why someone might take on a behavior, and it's not enough for it just to be the right thing to do or for them to make money. It really does come down to who else are they seeing doing it and demonstrating it, and also these kinds of perceived characteristics of this technology. And so this is something that we've merged into the other framework, which I'll show in just a moment. But is it better on their farm than some other practice they might take on? Is it compatible with the rest of their farming operation? How complex is it? Can they try it out before they dive fully in? And can they observe it over time? And other researchers have actually taken on a sixth component here of the perceived characteristics of a certain practice, and that's risk. And so Adam Reimer and others pulled in risk as this sixth component. And so if it introduces a lot of risk to someone's farm or operation, they might not feel compelled to take it on or adopt it. And so in my work at Iowa State, when I was a PhD student, we really wanted to kind of dig further into this and apply these frameworks in kind of an adapted way and understand how this impacts farmers' conservation adoption in the Midwest. We were looking at Iowa farmers specifically, but this is kind of how I think about these frameworks. I think about sort of the individual level factors that might be influencing whether or not, or predicting whether or not a farmer will take on a certain practice. And I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about which practices we looked at specifically. And then also the external factors. So again, like these outside influences that might be compelling them or presenting barriers to them taking on a new practice. So these all sort of inform what someone thinks about a certain conservation practice, which in turn adjust their attitude. What kind of attitudes do they have about that practice? Ultimately affecting whether they intend to adopt it and ultimately whether they do adopt it. And all of this comes from this impetus that right now, there are a lot of external or externalities, negative externalities. So environmental impacts, greenhouse gas emissions, climate resilience challenges on farms in our kind of conventional farming practices across the Midwest, especially with commodity row crops. And so in order to promote the spread of conservation practices on farms, we really need to think about what might be facilitating that adoption and what might be sort of restricting it or presenting more barriers. So for one study, we wanted to look at a couple specific conservation practices. So many studies in this body of literature look at one individual practice. So they look at, does a farmer take on no-till or not? Do they take on cover crops or not? So they look at individual practices, but what we wanted to do is kind of expand that view a little bit, be a little bit less prescriptive about it, and try and come up with a system for understanding how farmers might adopt sets of conservation practices, how they might work towards a conservation system on their farm with multiple practices. So for this, we utilized a survey of 6,000 Iowa farmers. It was originally, or it was developed for understanding water quality conservation efforts. But I think some of these certainly do apply in the climate resilience context. So the first that we wanted to look at in this conservation set is no-till. So several of you are probably already familiar, but no-till is a practice that is already adopted in a widespread way. I think in Iowa, we're at least a third of corn and soybean acres incorporate no-till to some extent, and others have reduced tillage as well. So we looked at whether farms utilize no-till anywhere on their farms. And that by using no-till, a farmer is essentially really minimizing the amount of disturbance to the soil when they are applying inputs or seed or planting, those kinds of operations. And so you end up with crop residue on the top, and that can protect soil, reduce soil erosion, and has a lot of other benefits as well. Cover crops is the second. This one has been ramping up over the last 15 years or so in Iowa. But it is in several states, it's kind of still in its like early stages of adoption across farms in the Midwest. And so cover crops are a winter vegetation that is planted in the fall. They allow it to grow a bit, and then if it's winter hardy, it'll come up again in the spring. And so it holds that soil in place. It can help reduce nitrogen runoff. It has a lot of several benefits that can apply on most Iowa farms. The third is extended rotation. So this is a system that would introduce a third or more crops into the corn and soybean rotation that we typically see in Iowa. And so what that can do is allow small grains or other crops growing in different parts of the year than corn and soybean typically do, and can kind of deal with different precipitation patterns, and also reduce soil erosion as well. So the reason we surveyed farmers on several other practices as well, but we wanted to look at these for a couple reasons. So as a conservation system, Iowa State Extension tends to provide a lot of support around these practices. They are recommended as a set through this Whole Farm Conservation Best Practices Manual and other extension resources. Also, you can feasibly, in most cases, apply these on any farm in Iowa. So applied to all of our all of our survey participants for the most part across the state, without too many restrictions regarding like typology or water bodies or things like that. So it gave us kind of a good sense of adoption across our entire sample, without some of those restrictions that other practices might have, depending on where your farm is or some other considerations. So we intended to address a couple of research gaps here. So the first was we wanted to understand intention or openness to a practice in our ultimate dependent variable. We wanted to measure this because most studies look at whether someone has adopted it. Let's understand the adopters, or whether they haven't. Let's understand the non-adopters. But we really wanted to kind of understand whether that middle category, someone who might be considering it but hasn't adopted it yet, really understand what makes them different. Are they unique in certain ways that we can kind of understand that next wave of adopters in Iowa agriculture? We also wanted to predict the use of multiple complementary conservation practices. So overall, our general research question for this specific study was, which factors influence farmers' progression towards adopting multiple complementary conservation practices, those being no-till, cover crops, and extended rotations? So a big challenge was coming up with a way to measure this, because we had 3 dimensions in terms of the 3 practices, as well as 3 dimensions in terms of their like adoption status. So they could respond that they were firmly a no on a certain practice, like I have not used it and will not use it in the future. They could respond with that middle intention category. I have not used this practice, but I might use it in the future. And then the third category being that they have used that practice in the previous season. And so what we opted to do was to consider no-till users only in this study for the sake of simplifying the overall framework. And I would like to look at those who didn't use no-till at some point. But for this, we were just looking at no-till users, understanding that previous literature suggests that no-till, because it's much more common, can be considered sort of a gateway conservation practice, and can kind of pave the way to adopting additional practices as well. So within that kind of colored box here, we've got no-till users. And we need to categorize farmers in terms of whether they did or didn't use these other practices, cover crops and extended rotations. And so we came up with 4 categories that any respondent could fall into. The first was no-till only. The second was no-till plus potential. So they use no-till and they are considering extended rotations and or cover crops. The third is no-till plus 1. So they used no-till and either extended rotations or cover crops. They might be interested in that third practice as well. And then we have full set users. So this is, they've used all 3 of those practices on their farms in the prior year. And the distribution here is we've got about 21% of participants were no-till only, 32 were no-till plus potential, 36% were no-till plus 1, and 10% were a full set user. And then we needed to measure, kind of in that framework before, how do we understand the factors that might influence adoption? So we had several measures for individual level characteristics, so their attitudes, perceptions, their demographics, the information about their farm itself, like size and types of amount of rental, whether they have pasture. External factors, we have information on influential information sources, as well as watershed group participation and receipt of cost share or technical assistance in the previous 5 years. So these are the results that we found, and essentially the way to interpret this is that we did a logistic regression with a multi-category dependent variable, and so essentially we're looking at what, for someone who falls higher on one of these independent variables, so support for action on conservation and water quality, perceived agronomic barriers, all of these independent variables, if someone falls higher on that, how much more likely are they to be in one of these upper categories compared with the no-till only? So essentially what we're finding is that, oh, hang on. So as far as individual level characteristics, you'll notice that someone who is more supportive of action is 11% more likely to be a no-till plus potential than they are a no-till only. So they are more likely to kind of hopefully take on or be considering other conservation practices than just no-till. By contrast, if they perceive there are agronomic barriers to conservation and water quality improvement in Iowa, then yield will be impacted by conservation was one example, then they're 15% less likely to be a no-till plus potential compared with a no-till only. And what you'll see with several of these, which we found really interesting, was that we actually get this sort of gradational effect. So the positive effects, like the support for action, has a much higher effect on for farmers, like if they're more likely to be supportive of action, then they are 88% more likely to be no-till plus 1 than no-till only. And then in turn, they are more than twice as likely to be a full set user versus a no-till only. So we kind of get this like gradational effect that these have on the outcome, whether a farmer is taking on more of that 3 practice set. And then by contrast, we see that with quite a few of those negative influential factors as well. So if they perceive that there are agronomic barriers, we get kind of that increasingly negative effect as we move along that conservation step ladder, we called it. So essentially, I'll kind of distill this down. So some key points here are that some of these factors are predictive of the quote step ladder stages and show that gradational effect. So an Iowa row crop farmer is more likely to be further along in this stepladder if they support taking action on nutrient loss and water quality. Again, this survey was focused on water quality issues. They're more likely to be further along if they are less concerned about there being agronomic barriers to water quality improvement in Iowa, if they own much of their land or have pasture, if they make decisions based on information from on-farm research NGOs, and consider private sector influences, private sector sources like retailers or input dealers less influential, if they have received cost share or technical assistance in the last 5 years, or participate in watershed management groups, of which there are several formal watershed groups in Iowa. So I also want to share, kind of shifting a little bit into a study that talks about, and thank you so much for adding questions in. I have a hard time flipping back and forth, so I'm gonna come to these afterwards, but thanks, and please continue to put questions in. Another study that we worked on was around perceptions to climate change and agriculture specifically. And so what we wanted to understand was I'll explain here in just a moment. But first, to talk about challenges in climate change communication. Several people on this webinar, I'm sure you deal with this in your own daily work, and so this will be familiar, but climate change can be a really sticky subject. People have very differing perceptions and level of concern in the Midwest when it comes to climate change. Research on climate change communications is focused on how effective certain communications might be or the outcomes of that communications. Traditional approaches have relied on the knowledge deficit model. So this is kind of this is falling out of favor, but it's this idea that if we just tell people the science and they just understand more about climate change and what's happening and what the science is saying, then we'll convince them. But what we're finding is that that doesn't adequately get at people's values, their own internal concerns or thinking, maybe some political issues with climate change that of course have become so prevalent. And so as opposed to this knowledge deficit model, audience segmentation is becoming viewed as one approach to move beyond that. Nerlich and others in a paper, I like that they describe this as connecting to people's values, fears, and hopes. And so the idea is not to share more technical information with them to convince them of something, but instead to connect with how they are feeling about things related to climate and weather and how that might impact their thinking. So for this study, we leaned on the 6 Americas super short survey. It's called the SASSY. And so the SASSY comes out of the Yale program on climate change communication. Several researchers have developed this questionnaire. There is a longer questionnaire that's like 32 questions to understand how someone feels about climate change. But they also tested and found that 4 of those questions can get you really far in understanding where someone falls on the climate change spectrum in terms of like belief and engagement. And so anyone who does surveys knows that it's really hard to get people to do the surveys. And so anything that can kind of shorten that instrument and reduce survey taker burden can really help a lot. Because if you can use 4 questions instead of 32, that can be great for survey development. So essentially this 4-question SASSY, the super short questionnaire, assigns or types each respondent based on their responses into one of 6 categories. So we have dismissive, doubtful, disengaged, cautious, concerned, and alarmed. I'll show you what those 4 questions are on the next slide. But what we were looking into is, first we wanted to know what happens if we apply this with Iowa farmers. What will that help? Will that help us understand their general attitudes and concerns about climate change? What does the Iowa farmer population look like in this regard? Our second question was, among Iowa farmers, do these 6 Americas types vary in their attitudes related to climate change and specifically its impacts on agriculture and farming? The SASSY asks very general questions about They use the terminology global warming. But we wanted to know, does that is that associated with, or does it correlate with someone's beliefs related to climate and agriculture specifically? So for this, we use the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll. So if anyone's not familiar, this data goes back to 1982, and the questions shift year to year. There's a random sample of Iowa farmers. It has a panel component, so we actually generally have the same sample year to year, with some folks coming in or coming out for various reasons. But because of that panel component, we have very high response rates. So we use data from 2020 and 2021. In 2020, we had an 80% response rate. In 2021, it was 62. So these are the 4 questions on the left side for this SASE, the super short survey. How important is the issue of global warming to you personally? How worried are you about global warming? How much do you think global warming will harm you personally? And how much do you think global warming will harm future generations of people? And what you can see in the graph is the blue are respondents for the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll. So these are Iowa farmers. The red is the 2020 national estimate. There are more recent statistics. We just, at the time that we did this study, we only had the 2020 estimate. So I'll be updating that before we publish. But essentially, what you'll see is that Iowa farmers, the highest categories are dismissive, doubtful, and cautious. There's a bit of a flip. So the general national population, most are concerned or alarmed about global warming. And quite a few are cautious as well. I do want to caution people not to assume this is because this is something unique to Iowa farmers, or something about the agricultural community. We are going to look into more whether there are other kind of mediating factors like age, other demographics that might define that more. So if we can break down the national estimate, we might see that it could be the fact that it's the farming population, but it could be other factors that are sort of conflating this comparison a little bit. So just adding a little caveat there. So what we wanted to understand, okay, we've categorized all of our respondents into these six categories, but we want to know, how do these perspectives align with their perceptions related to agriculture and climate specifically? So we had a set of questions that asked about attitudes related to perceived risks, adaptation, action, and resources, and climate mitigation. And so I'll walk through this a little bit. Don't worry about the numbers, more just that you'll see some color patterns here. But what we did was we kind of broke down these 6 Americas types along the top and broke them down into categories in terms of their attitudes. So these are 2 items related to perceived risks about climate on their farm. So I believe that extreme weather events will happen more frequently in the future. I'm concerned about the potential impacts. And what we see is that among dismissive farmers, quote unquote dismissive farmers around climate change, a lot of them, they really were heavily uncertain or some slight disagreement around these issues related to risks of extreme weather. By contrast, those on the other side of the spectrum, the alarmed, were heavily agreeing. Most of them were agreeing or strongly agreeing with these statements. And what we see is this kind of, when you fill it in, we do see this kind of shift. So when you're on one side of the spectrum, you see high levels of uncertainty or disagreement, and then it kind of gradually moves towards higher levels of agreement as you move along that 6 Americas spectrum. Similarly, we had a lot of questions related to adaptation, action, and resources. And so again, we see kind of a mix here, but a lot of uncertainty, some agreement, some disagreement among dismissives. And then among the alarmed, again, we see high levels of agreement, and in some cases, strongly agreeing. And again, we see kind of that gradational effect here. So what this is starting to suggest is that there is really a pretty strong correlation between that 6 Americas response and how people feel about climate change and agriculture specifically, suggesting that just that 4-question survey can really help us get at some of these more specific and nuanced perspectives. A third one is mitigation. So whether the government should do more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or whether I should do more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And again, we see a really similar pattern here. And in fact, it is quite a bit more polarized when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions. Those who are on the dismissive side have much more strong disagreement with these statements, and those who are on the alarmed side have strong agreement and very low disagreement, if any. And so quite a strong polarization when we talk about these specific issues. Probably not surprising to those of you who work with in climate change and ag. So some key points here. So the 6 Americas typology can be indicative of more specific perceptions of climate change and agriculture. A third of Iowa farmers were concerned or alarmed about global warming. 42% were dismissive or doubtful. High levels of uncertainty and disagreement were related to perceived risks, adaptation, and mitigation. And again, that mitigation piece, greenhouse gas emissions statements were really polarizing among Iowa farmers. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some programs where we're taking kind of our understanding of the existing conservation and adoption literature around practice adoption, climate smart ag, and applying that in some really practical ways. So the first I want to share about is the Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Fellowship. Actually, I have a better slide here. So this is a program that currently is funded through a USDA National Institutes for Food and Ag funding call that, and this specific project was funded last year and it's ongoing. And this is led out of the University of Maine, but involves several partners and multiple USDA climate hubs. And what we're doing with this program is taking in farmer fellows as well as ag advisor fellows to go through a climate adaptation and mitigation fellowship training as well as on-farm planning. A really unique aspect of this program is that it pairs farmers and ag advisors together. So they go through the program, it's a 2-year program, and they go through it together and work on-farm planning as well as receive formal training. And so we have 112 fellows across 14 states. The USDA Midwest Climate Hub is leading this second one listed here, road crops in the Midwest. So we have 17 fellows who are working, who are either row crop farmers or ag advisors, like through industry, NRCS, Extension, and others. And they're working through some on-farm planning and kind of guided by expertise and educators in the field. So it's a really like high level of partnership here. And what this really draws on is I love this word. I didn't know this word before, andragogy. There are theories around adult learning, and so what can like speak to adult learners, and in this case farmers and ag advisors, and how can we tap into that to design some really unique and powerful programming for their purposes. And so some aspects of this that lean on that set of theories, as well as kind of drawing on this, a lot of the diffusion of innovations work. Earlier, we had seen that chart of like, or that diagram of practices or innovations spreading throughout a community. So we have folks working in pairs. We provide education, but also planning and support, as well as implementation and cross-sharing and peer support within the program. And so we also expect fellows to they are compensated for conducting outreach within their communities. And so it's our hope that it really draws on that opinion leader aspect, trusted peer information sources. And so hopefully can start to demonstrate how we can take things beyond the knowledge deficit model, just educating folks on technical aspects or the issues, but getting into kind of peer work that can encourage a little more engagement with the information and the issues at hand. Oh, yeah, and there's that diagram. Another program I wanted to describe kicked off this year. And so we provided some like development, like conceptual support here. But it's led out of Illinois Extension by Dwayne Friend, who's a climate specialist in that program. I'm not sure if he's in this call or not. And Dwayne wanted to develop a course for Illinois Extension specialists. And so we called it Integrating Climate into Extension Programming. And the idea is to provide extension specialists throughout the state with a deeper understanding of climate science and fundamentals, but also some pretty in-depth modules around how to communicate about climate, climate equity, how to actually incorporate it into their programming. So they come from all topic areas in extension and focus areas. So whether they're working in communities or 4-H or ag and natural resources, how can you take climate and incorporate it in a way that speaks to, works for your audience? And so we also, this was a self-guided online course, but we also facilitated 2 live sessions to encourage more of that peer learning and integrate, working on them with integrating climate into their existing programming. And so the hope is that, we can build capacity of Midwest scale among trusted information sources like Extension and others. I think this could potentially be duplicated or replicated and applied in other contexts. Maybe there's opportunities to do this with ag advisors in industry or other areas. And so I welcome thoughts from all of you about how we might kind of further some of this work and tap into this as more. So with that, I'll put my contact information here on the slide, and I will start reading through some of these questions here. And yeah, thank you so much for having me, Hans, and everyone for being here.
Thank you, Laurie. Do you want me to feed you questions, or would you prefer to just take them?
How about I'll work through the chat here, and then maybe if you want to call on folks after that could work, I suppose, or we can both do that. So it looks like questions. Okay, so did you use a questionnaire? I'm looking at Nafisa's, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, question here. Did you use a questionnaire for the individual level characteristics and external factors study? If yes, then what types of questions did you ask? Thanks, Nafisa. I kind of, for the sake of time, left out quite a few about a lot about the survey instrument there, but that was that first study I described, and that was let me see if I can get up there. I think I have some respondent numbers here, and that was the thanks, Hans, for putting that poll up. So this was what was called the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy Farmer Survey. And so this was conducted over 2015 to 2019 in Iowa. And it was administered by Iowa State University with partners. And this focused a lot on understanding attitudes, information sources, concerns and awareness around water quality at the time. And also asked about adoption. So have you adopted or used certain conservation practices in the prior season? Something unique about that study is it did do kind of these like broad samples, pretty large samples. Again, the full respondent number was 6,006 farmers, but some of them were resampled 1, 2, or 3 years later. And so we actually have an interesting panel component. We're just putting together a manuscript now that looks at how that time gap is affecting adoption. So is that 1 to 2 to 3 year time enough to measure sort of change in their responses about certain conservation practices? And so yeah, it was a pretty in-depth survey of farmers, and there's quite a bit more analysis to come out of that. So more to come there, I suppose. Someone asked, did you use qualitative methods for this project? And I will say that so we did not use qualitative methods for this project. I think this was purely quantitative. So we had this nutrient reduction strategy poll survey among farmers, but we also had the second study showed the Iowa Farm and Rural Life poll. I do think there's a lot of work that could be done with qualitative work and really kind of digging more into perceptions and concerns around these issues. Not as much has been published around that, and I think if someone's interested, then there's a lot to be done on that side of things. So Yeah, let's see. Oh, Alexa made a point about, I think about the knowledge deficit model, a point that has not fallen out of favor among many scientists. And I agree that we do need to, I guess maybe a better way to say this is that sharing the technical information and the science with someone is necessary, but not sufficient to change perceptions and behaviors. And so it might convince several people, but having someone understand more about the science is not necessarily, in a lot of cases, is not predictive of someone changing their belief system or understanding. And so absolutely, like communicating the science is still a hugely important. Thanks for pointing this out. But it is not sufficient in a lot of cases to overcome a lot of the other like social norms and milieu that people are operating in that can affect their beliefs and perceptions around these issues. Let's see. Scott says, I'd be very interested to see how the results change if you ask the same questions about changing weather patterns instead of global warming. And I agree, terminology is a huge one here, and it's a little hard when one survey has one set of terms and one has another. I did do some like preliminary analysis on those climate and agriculture statements. Let's see if I can get to those. Give you an
I just
example.
want to interrupt quickly to state I'll leave the poll open for one more minute and then I'll shut it down. So please complete that if you haven't. And Laurie Crystal's comment afterward kind of ties into that as well.
Oh, thanks. Great. Okay, let me read Crystal's really quick and then I'll talk about this. So where climate and water quality practices have a lot of overlap and with the divergence of views of climate, are we doing a disservice by naming and focusing more on climate smart than on focus water benefits? Yeah, okay, both great points. So regarding the terminology of climate and weather patterns, so Scott, you've pointed out that we've used global warming through one established set questionnaire. Climate change is one that we would use quite a bit, and also this extreme weather events or variability. And I did notice that we did get really differing and kind of predictable responses when it came to what kind of terminology we use. So I did look into the levels of agreement just based on terminology and we found that, so just if you compare these two statements, I believe that extreme weather events will happen more frequently. I'm concerned about the impacts of climate change. And what we found overall was that there was, and you can see it a bit here, but it was pretty clear in some preliminary analysis that statements that use that term extreme weather received higher overall agreement than the statements that use the term climate change. And so at least among the sample, among Iowa farmers, yes, we do see that kind of differentiation in like someone's responses potentially due to that use of terminology. And so again, probably not surprising to most of you on the call, but that how we describe something matters in this case. And then your point about water quality benefits versus climate change. I think, Crystal, you make a point that speaks to why this audience segmentation matters. And so if we understand our audience better, then we might understand whether to talk about climate change or climate smart or other benefits that might come around with conservation adoption. And so, you know, if we happen to be among a group of farmers that you can feel certain might fall closer on this concerned or alarmed scale, then speaking to their fears and values and hopes around climate change could be really effective. But by contrast, if we're in a space where we're speaking with farmers who tend to fall more on this side of the spectrum, then certainly they're going to prioritize other concerns or factors, maybe water quality, maybe soil health, maybe something else. And so, you know, this is an attempt to measure that, but I think that's what a lot of people who speak about climate or other conservation issues definitely feel when they're speaking to different audiences. Let's see, Jennifer, why do you think private advisors seem to have relatively little influence on survey respondents? And Sarah responds, maybe not little influence, but instead of negative influence. And yeah, I'll find the slide in case anyone didn't see that. So what we found with this water quality focused or nutrient reduction focused survey is that these measures, private sources of influence, specifically, I think it was seed retailers, fertilizer dealers, and private co-op agronomists, were negatively associated with adoption of cover crops, as well in a study we just did on cover crops, as well as this stepladder 3 practice study. A lot of other surveys show that when you take out kind of that conservation perspective, those groups, those sources of information are very trusted and they're very influential. But I think generally those surveys are showing that they're influential regarding agronomic and on-farm decision-making around production. And I think this is still up for debate. So I welcome discussion around this because it's important. By contrast, we were asking specifically about sources of information around conservation and water quality. And social connections, these on-farm research NGOs, in some cases public entities like Extension or NRCS, did have a much higher effect on conservation adoption, positive association with conservation adoption. And so I think it matters what you trust someone for. I think it's okay that certain groups are more trusted for some types of information and others for other types of information. So it really could come down to, not that I'm sure CCAs aren't out there saying don't take up cover crops in most cases, but it does in some cases maybe conflict with or add to the work that they would need to do with other advising that they're doing. And so it's maybe just a differentiation and focus of what they're talking to farmers about. So just want to point out that it could be, it's certainly very nuanced, but it is something that we noted certainly in that survey. Okay, let's see, Hans, where am I now on the questions?
You can go up or down from that previous question. John Porter
see.
has something that you skipped, and then the
Oh.
thesis below it.
What did I skip?
John asks, any thoughts on the influence of monetary motivations on adopting climate smart practices?
Thank you. Influence of monetary motivations. Yeah. So that was less clear in the studies that I've been a part of analyzing. So in some cases, economic concerns and barriers play a really big role, but in some cases they don't. So I will say that in a study we published around just cover crops, I think economic barriers, like concerns about being able to afford to implement conservation practices or have access to funding, was definitely or how it might impact their income, did have was predictive of whether or not they used cover crops. Essentially, if they felt strongly that economics were a barrier, they were less likely to adopt cover crops. That didn't show up in this 3 practice analysis, but that's not to say it's not important. But I think, kind of speaking to the audience segmentation thing, it's another one where I think we could do a lot more to understand better what values we're trying to tap into when we're speaking about issues. Not every individual farmer can care about every issue or conservation topic, and so certainly there are several out there that probably the economic discussion resonates more with them. I think at this point I'm not sure to what extent I don't think we can say everybody feels that way, but I do think that there are probably some audiences that where that would definitely be more of a concern and might encourage them to consider adoption of conservation in other ways if it promotes resilience from an economic standpoint. That was wordy, but yeah.
Okay, I've got one more question and then we're going to wrap. Diane asks, were the 4 questions in the same survey as a perceived risk question?
Diane, yes. Okay, let me, sort of. Okay, so they were both part of the Iowa Farm and Rural Life poll. The SASE, so those 4 questions were in the 2021. And those climate and ag questions were in the 2020 survey. So they were in separate waves of the survey, but we only looked at the panel respondents. And so we could see if they were categorized as a certain category in the 2021 questionnaire, we knew their responses to these in the 2020 questionnaire. So for those who maybe don't have a good sense of like the terminology, the survey terminology here, panel means that you ask the same respondents year to year. And so so they were not in the same survey that was mailed out, but they were 1 year apart. Let's see.
So
Crystal,
Nafisa
yeah. Oh, go
is
ahead.
asking if she can send you an email. So can you
Oh,
forward to the end of your presentation where you showed that for everybody?
I will pop my email in here and then yeah, I'll go down to that slide as well.
Because
And
that'll be
thanks
a great
everyone for
slide to end the
comments here
recording on,
too.
so people will be able to get there quickly.
There we go. And this is our website as well, Climate Hope's website. Yeah, and I'll work through some of these other comments. Yeah, thanks everybody for these questions. And definitely looking forward to hearing from folks who want to discuss some of this more and how we can better harness the social science that's coming out, whether, you know, not just my work, but there's lots of folks working on similar types of studies. And to the point about qualitative work, I think there's a lot of really important qualitative work coming out now. And there's a lot we can do to kind of apply that and implement that and build our programs better as well. So, yeah. Any other
Absolutely.
questions or?
Being cognizant of time, I think we'll go ahead and wrap here. Appreciate everyone for participating today. Lots of great questions and comments in the chat. And thank you, Laurie, for presenting for us. We'll be back with another North Central Climate Collaborative webinar in 2 months and look forward to seeing or reading from you again then. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me on.